Now, here's Ed Bernstein.
The Lufthansa Heist is probably one of the most fascinating, unsolved crimes ever in the history of America. And with me today is Daniel Simone, who is the author in collaboration with Henry Hill, who has been a guest on our show. I mean, Henry's kind of a mobster. Not kind of, he is.
He is.
And in keeping with that, a little bit later on in the show, we're going to have Geoff Schumacher from the Mob Museum. He's going to talk about Las Vegas's role in mobs, mafia, etc. Anyway, the Lufthansa heist. Now, this was in the 70s. I kind of remember it. And I just need to read kind of an opening sentence here. That the perpetrators, it was in the Lufthansa Cargo terminal. There was like $6 million. What was $6 million doing in an airline terminal?
Well, these were funds, monies that Lufthansa had been contracted to transport back from Europe. And American Express contracted Lufthansa to do so because these were monies that American tourists had exchanged for what was then available as money orders. American Express, not money orders, but travel checks. To be more
It was a
precise.
big business in those days.
It was a big business, correct, yes. So this was a regularity where shipments came in from Europe on the average of perhaps 2 to 3 times per week. And for the most part, they were all small denominations, 5s, 10s, $20 bills. And they were unmarked because it would have been impractical to mark each and every one of these little tiny bills.
Sure.
And what was this money doing over a period of a weekend in a storage facility at the cargo building? Well, that's the question that's very, very interesting, which leads to the actual robbery. The inside individual who actually organized the robbery, or at least from the technical perspective, his name was Louis Werner. He was a shipping clerk. And he was in debts up to his eyeballs with bookmakers and loan sharks. So he couldn't repay his gambling debts, and he proposed to one of his bookmakers to provide details and information for a group of gunmen to foray inside the cargo building and walk out with whatever monies, cash, and other valuables may have been stored in what they called the high-value vault. And what happened is that the shipment arrived on a Friday afternoon from Germany. And Brinks came to pick up the monies, as they usually did. But there was a procedure that Lufthansa had recently implemented that before the money could be released to Brinks, a supervisor on duty had to sign off for the handover of the shipment. Louis Werner made himself unavailable. He was the foreman on duty during that particular shift when Brinks came to collect the money. So Louis Werner made himself unavailable, and the Brinks guards waited around, waited 20 minutes, half hour, and they had to move on to their next stop. So they told whoever clerk was on duty that they would return Monday morning to pick up the shipment, and they left. So this money, the $6 million, was left over a weekend, practically unguarded. Sure, the high-value vault had an alarm system, but in 1978, the most sophisticated alarm system could probably be disarmed by a toddler.
Right.
And this was part of the plan, to leave the monies over the weekend, and of course, this information was relayed to the mastermind of the robbery, which ultimately turned out to be Jimmy the Gent Burke. And of course, the rest was easy to carry out.
Now, has anybody ever been convicted or as a result of this, and has the money ever been returned?
Louis Werner was the only individual who was tried and convicted. The only amount of money recovered was $17,000, which had been paid to Louis Werner as a down payment. And of course, when he was arrested, the $17,000 was confiscated by the FBI. So that $17,000 is the only amount that was actually ever recovered. Louis Werner was offered a plea deal if he cooperated with the authorities in helping the FBI apprehend the other culprits. Unfortunately, Louis Werner did not know who actually carried out the robbery, because the organizer of the robbery, Jimmy Burke, as I mentioned, shielded himself from speaking or dealing directly with Werner Porsche. So in essence, Louis Werner was dealing with an intermediary whom he only knew by his first name, and this individual went by the name of Joe and nothing more. So when Lou Werner was arrested, he wasn't able to provide any information of value. And of course, besides the fact that he remained staunch and stoic, denying that he had any complicity or any involvement, and of course the U.S. attorney proceeded with prosecuting him, and he was easily found guilty and sentenced to prison. And then 6 months after into his sentence, he decided to cooperate. So he contacted the U.S. attorney from his prison and offered information. But by then, it was too late, because anyone who had been involved in the robbery, directly or indirectly, had already been murdered.
There was a series of homicides.
13 in all, yes.
13?
13 in all.
In what period of time?
Within a 6-month time frame immediately after the robbery.
So somebody was executing these co-conspirators.
The mastermind, Jimmy Burke, had good reason to do so. His incentives were, A, he didn't want to share the haul with his cohorts, and secondly, he had a better incentive, a better reason. He didn't want to risk that anyone could possibly, at some point in the future, testify against him. So to ensure that he would be shielded from any prosecution, he systematically murdered every single one who was directly involved in the robbery or who had information about the robbery. And this is basically how it all ended. It frustrated the FBI, because as the FBI was at the heels of one of the suspects, incredibly, Jimmy Burke had a way of knowing that this individual was about to be apprehended or at least interrogated, and he liquidated them. So it seemed very likely that Jimmy Burke had a mole inside the FBI, because it was simply too coincidental that just as the investigators were about to arrest or interrogate the 6 suspects who were actually the gunmen, miraculously they disappeared, or they vanished, or they turned out dead somewhere in the trunk of a car. And for those reasons, it was suspected that Jimmy Burke probably had a very, very reliable mole within the ranks of the FBI.
And what is Henry Hill's involvement in the story?
Henry Hill was friendly with the bookmaker who was exerting pressure on Louis Werner. And when the bookmaker was presented with this alternate arrangement of payments, that is, information as to how to get into the Lufthansa Cargo building, the bookmaker did not have the capability to assemble a band of robbers capable of pulling off such a caper, and the bookmaker brought it to the attention of Henry Hill. Henry Hill had just gotten out of prison. He was on parole. He really didn't want any part of it. He didn't want to risk that, violating his parole. So he brought it to the attention of his supervisor, so-called Jimmy the Gent Burke. And Jimmy the Gent Burke embraced the idea. He selected 6 armed robbers whom he thought were capable of pulling off this type of a stunt. And that was really the extent of Henry Hill's involvement.
We have some video with you and Henry Hill discussing the book. Let's take a look at that.
They also know that it was you guys involved.
Ed McDonald can explain how many law enforcement, I mean, they observed us 24/7, every one of us, that, because they knew it was us. We all just come home from the can, me and Jimmy just come from the can, and they knew, that, we had, it was our territory, and we did it.
Now, the actual payment to Paul Vario, I guess Jimmy Burke handled it.
Yeah, of course.
Jimmy Burke handled it, and he did pay him, unlike the
Well,
fact that...
you want to say, Honestly, to answer you 100% honestly, I don't know how the money with those guys were divided. I know that there was 11 bodies. 11 guys were killed
As a result of
As a
this.
result of it, yeah. But, well, 9 guys and 2 wives. You know what I mean? And I guess Jimmy figured for $1.50 bullet was cheaper than paying the guy, 300,
Makes sense.
400.
Makes
well,
economic
to
sense.
you, it makes sense.
What did you get out of it?
I wound up with maybe 100 lots, you know what I mean? Just
Well,
chump
then you
change.
did pretty well, relatively
I didn't
speaking.
do pretty well.
I mean, relatively speaking to the others.
Well, I'm the only sole survivor. I mean,
You're standing
seriously.
up, right?
I'm the last dinosaur.
So Henry is, just said it. He's the only sole survivor, and so you used Henry as a source, and then you had the U.S. attorney.
The U.S. Attorney, Ed McDonald, the 2 leading FBI agents who spearheaded the investigation. I also had the assistance of a retired New York City detective, Joe Coffey, who recently passed about a year ago. And I was fortunate to have had the volunteering cooperation of several former mafia gangsters who were indirectly involved in the crime, and to the extent that at very least they had knowledge of what Jimmy Burke had been planning.
And when you interview these people, as they get older, why are they so willing to talk to you?
Well, first of all, the statutes of limitations for any crimes that they may have had committed had already expired. And secondly, many of these individuals love to be interviewed in front of cameras. So as long as I was able to arrange a videotaped interview, they confessed or they spilled out whatever I wanted for them to tell me.
And none of the money other than the $17,000 you talked about was recovered. Who took the loss? Was it American Express or
Lufthansa took the
Lufthansa?
loss.
Yeah.
They were insured, but Lufthansa did not file a claim. I guess they had their own reasons for taking the loss themselves. But in essence, yes, Lufthansa was the sole victim of this entire affair.
You don't really hear much about Lufthansa Airlines anymore. I mean, it was a pretty prominent player in those days, but they're still in business, right?
They're still in business, very much so. But I could tell you one thing, that when the book was first published, above their cargo building at Kennedy Airport, they had a huge 60-foot long sign, perhaps 3 feet high, yellow, very, very glaring, and they quickly removed it. So now,
Okay, they're flying under the radar instead of over the radar right now. But the name of the book is the Lufthansa Heist. It's a fascinating story. As they say, truth is often stranger than fiction, and maybe a movie in the future on this book, right?
well, the book was optioned by Emmy Award winner Cayman Grant and her company Steel Titan Productions. And it has been optioned for a full feature film for theaters and perhaps alternatively as a television series.
Now, you just spoke at the Mob Museum. How cool is it that we have a Mob Museum here in Las Vegas?
It's a wonderful organization. The exhibits are overwhelming, very, very intriguing, very interesting. And yes, I'm proud to say that I'm a friend of the Mob Museum.
Well, good. We'll be right back with Geoff Schumacher from the Mob Museum.
If you forgot to pay your cell phone bill, it's your fault. But if you've been hurt in an accident, injured at work, or denied Social Security benefits, it's your fault if you don't call Ed. Enough said. Call Ed. EdBernstein.com.
We have a really cool thing to do in Las Vegas, and it's called the Mob Museum. And with me now is Geoff Schumacher, who is, and I love this title, Director of Content, because when I think of the title, I think about, typically a Director of Content is somebody who's stopping things from appearing and airing, right? I mean,
I suppose in an Orwellian world, that would be the title, right? For someone
Right.
who's censoring things.
but you're actually encouraging.
That's right. I'm developing, I'm creating. Yeah.
Right. So what is it that you do?
Well, so as the director of content, it's sort of like being the chief historian for the museum. So I work on developing new exhibits. I develop public programming, so we have speakers. I'm involved with that. And digital content for our website, and then other kinds of programming that we do in the museum, guided tours and anything that has to do with the history.
And what was the incentive to create a mob museum? I mean, it just seems to me like if you're going to create any kind of museum, well, maybe is this going to be financially successful? It's a mob museum. Who's going to come? But it seems like it's tremendously successful.
Well, you'll recall that when the idea was first surfaced,
So you can tell it has something to do with Oscar, right?
Mayor Oscar Goodman was essentially his idea, and the community was divided on it, as I recall. You know, people were like, well, we don't want to glorify the mob. Why would we do that? But I think he was really on to something, because the success of the museum has been amazing. We had 322,000 people come through the museum last year, which was up 20% from the year before, which we were up 20% from the year before that. So people are really embracing the subject matter. It's organized crime, the history of organized crime, and the history of law enforcement combating organized crime, right? So it's a balanced story, it's an exciting story, and it intersects with American history in so many ways.
And look, you have a lot of experience in this, because you worked at the Review Journal and at City Life, and you know how living and growing up in Vegas in the late 70s and the 80s, the tension and the fights between the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI, and some organized crime members. I mean, it was in the headlines of the newspaper here every day.
Every day.
Yeah.
That's a big part of the museum. You know, we cover the entire history nationally of organized crime, but the fact is that probably the impetus for the museum more than anything else was that period in Las Vegas history, which is depicted in the movie Casino, and a lot of prominent figures in town who are still prominent in town were very involved in that. Some of them have passed away, and others were killed and buried in a cornfield, right? But I mean, that was an extremely electric time in Las Vegas, and I think people look back, if not fondly on it, they remember it very vividly.
Yeah, and today's museums are a little bit different than they have been in the past, and they seem like we have these virtual reality things. Everything is touch and feel. It's an experience more than just being passive as you're going through an attraction or a museum. And you have these things at the museum called Mobots. What are they?
Well, it's a new project for us, and we've taken some technology and put it to use in our museum. In a way, we look at all the different advances in technology and figure out how it might work in the museum. In this case, we take it's like a virtual tour. So if you are, let's say you're disabled, or you're someone who just can't get to the museum, and you're living in Cleveland or Florida or Japan or wherever you happen to be, but you really want to see the museum, you can order up a virtual tour and watch it on your computer screen. And we have an educator, one of our staff members, that guides this Mobot through the halls of the museum and shows you the museum, gives you some information. You can ask questions back and forth. You get to steer the robot. So you say, wait, I want to look at this thing over here. You steer over there and take a look at it. So it's a really cool thing, and it's not unlike something you could do on your phone, right, nowadays.
Yeah.
But it is a little more, we've planned it out. We have a very formal presentation, and I think it's one of those innovations that we're really proud of.
And you also working with some of the schools on an educational program. We have some videotape I'd like to show our viewers.
Our new standards-based education outreach program. This new program introduces students to the history of Las Vegas, prohibition, organized crime, and law enforcement through a variety of unique presentations. Trained museum educators travel to schools with historical objects and activities that bring content to life through immersive, interactive lesson plans.
I think my favorite part about the presentation is the keys and the postcards. There's this awesome ashtray that's supposed to look exactly like the Hoover Dam.
I never seen anything like that before.
The kids are engaged and they seem to be learning a lot of history about Nevada. It's a little bit more in depth than just reading about it.
Students use Common Core aligned strategies to interpret primary sources. Differentiated curriculum allows teachers to customize topics and activities.
It aligns with our Nevada history standards, and they're able to learn especially about the Great Depression and the impact the Hoover Dam had.
I like this presentation a lot.
Somebody will really love the Mob Museum presentation.
It was a fun activity for them, and it was fun to see them think about those things.
You know, it seems that Las Vegas makes a lot of sense to have a mob museum, because it kind of, at that time in Las Vegas in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, it seems that Las Vegas demonstrated organized crime in its heyday. Yeah. And then you kind of had a front row seat to watching the demise of organized crime slowly dissipate as you go into the 70s, 80s in Las Vegas. So it's like a perfect laboratory to view it.
I agree completely. And two things happened in Las Vegas that makes it a good place. One, it was a nexus for all these different organized crime groups, right? You had people here from New York, from Chicago, from Cleveland, from LA, from all the different points of the United States. They didn't necessarily live here. They didn't create any kind of an indigenous culture of crime here, but they all made money here. They found a way. This was a racket. Las Vegas was the biggest racket after bootlegging during Prohibition, right? They took millions and millions and millions of dollars out of Las Vegas. So it was very important to the mob all over the country.
So there was a kind of a transition from liquor into gambling?
I think so, yeah, definitely. And they were looking, after Prohibition ended in 1933, the organized crime were like, okay, what are we going to do next? And gambling became the biggest thing. And then skimming from the casinos in Las Vegas became the biggest thing. But then, as you noted, you also had this really high-profile demise, this dissolution of what they were doing. And it was a product of the feds and the State Gaming Control Board and the local police finally sort of getting together and saying, you know what, it's time that we deal with this problem. Because we hadn't worked that hard to crack down on skimming for a while.
Right, and it seems like, so sexy that, Robert Kennedy was involved in, helping shut this down at the same time that his family was really actively involved with organized crime.
The Kennedys are a fascinating subject, and that's one of those intersections between organized crime and the rest of American history, right? On the one hand, you had Jack Kennedy, who arguably his election in 1960 had a lot to do with Sam Giancana and the Chicago outfit helping to get him elected in West Virginia and Illinois. So he was pals with Frank Sinatra. And through him, he knew a lot of these organized crime guys. On the other hand, his brother Robert after Kennedy's elected, he is promoted to Attorney General, and he is a great enemy of organized crime. And he is trying to crack down all over the country, including in Nevada. He threatened to shut down all the casinos in Nevada at one point, and Nevada Governor Grant Sawyer heroically, flew back to Washington and talked to him and talked to Jack, and it's not clear exactly what happened, but they didn't end up raiding all the casinos.
But the result of what did happen is Nevada got really serious about controlling and gaming control and organizing processes, procedures, and laws to strictly monitor what was going on in the casinos.
It was sort of the ultimate wake-up call, right? If the Attorney General of the United States is saying, we're going to shut down your primary industry, you may want to work a little harder to prevent that from happening. And I think you saw that with gaming control laws and a lot more enforcement.
I think you can't really talk about the Mob Museum without talking about Oscar Goodman. and
I take it you've met him, you know him.
Worked for him for a while. But I can remember, standing, his law office is 50 yards from mine, and I used to watch him walk up and down 4th Street into the federal courthouse with, various clients that were being indicted. And, it was really amazing to a lot of people that he was able to transform that reputation as a mob attorney into a successful politician and mayor. I mean, I think a lot of people were skeptical of that
remember, I think it was the Las Vegas Review-Journal who editorialized with the headline on their editorial was, "Anybody but Oscar," right?
Kind of like a Trump mantra now.
Almost.
Right?
You can't imagine the possibility that he would be our mayor. And yet, I think it turned out that he was a very good mayor, and people really bought into him once they figured out that he wasn't just this sort of mouthpiece for the mob, that he had a little more going with it. And then the same thing happened when he came up with the Mob Museum idea. People thought, well, this is just going to be a monument to Oscar. It didn't really turn out that way, and certainly there's a little piece in the museum about him, justifiably so, but and it's a much bigger story than that.
What's your favorite story over at the Mob Museum?
It's hard to narrow them down, but I would have to say one of them that I like very much is a new artifact that we have on display. And there was an FBI agent during those late 70s, early 80s in town named Mark Casper. And Mark donated a pair of handcuffs to the museum. This was just last year. And he said, these are the handcuffs that I used to arrest Tony Spilatro. And I'd like you to have them. And then I said, well, we'll put those on display. And he told the story behind it. This was one of the many arrests of Tony Spilatro in those days. Mark goes to Spilatro's house over in the southeast part of the valley, and he knocks on the door. This is in the morning, and Tony opens the door in his silk pajamas, and he kind of knew somebody was coming, but he was still early. And Tony says, very politely, he says, do you mind, if I change before, we go uptown? And Mark is a Texan, very gentlemanly FBI agent. He's like, yeah, sure, Tony, go ahead. Tony goes back in the house, changes into a best suit and tie. He's all spiffed up, and they come out. And at that point, Mark, in theory, should have put the handcuffs on him, but it was still quite a decent collegial relationship. They went ahead and put Tony in the back of the car, and they drove downtown to the Foley Federal Building, which was the building then, the courthouse then. And they asked, at that point, they get out of the car. Tony still doesn't have the handcuffs on, but they look in the distance and they see a mob of reporters, TV, newspaper press, photographers, and Mark's like, Tony, look, I've got to put the handcuffs on you for the show. I mean, it's required by policy. And Tony's like, oh, okay, that's fine. Normally they would put him on behind, but Mark put him on in front, and they walked up to the cameras. And that picture was published all over the country, including in Newsweek magazine. And but those are the very handcuffs that we use. So it's not a real adventure story, but I thought it was pretty telling about that era.
And I should say, like the building that the Mob Museum is housed in also is very historical. Right? It was at one time a courthouse.
It was the original federal courthouse for Las Vegas and a post office. A lot of people remember it as a post office, where you get your mail in the whole downtown area. But it was all the federal agencies were in there at that time. And but the courthouse was the big attraction.
Hey Geoff, thank you so much. And you can catch the Mob Museum more information. What's your website?
The website is www.themobmuseum.org.
Themobmuseum.org, downtown, across the street from the old City Hall there, right on Stewart. See you next week.
When sorry is not enough. Enough said. Call Ed. EdBernstein.com.